Mrs. Henderson, a woman who kept her lawn pristine and her opinions harsher, watched from her window. The new family was moving in, a flurry of activity and noise. Her gaze fixed on the daughter, round-faced and giggling as she struggled with a box twice her size. Mrs. Henderson scoffed. "Another one," she muttered, her disdain for the overweight girl already taking root. Mrs. Henderson believed in order, in discipline. Seeing someone, especially a child, so clearly exceeding societal expectations bothered her. It spoke of a lack of control, a weakness she found appalling. She pursed her lips, eyes narrowing as the girl, oblivious to her scrutiny, continued to unpack. Mrs. Henderson knew then that their paths would cross and she would not shy away from setting things right. From that day forward, Mrs. Henderson made it her mission to observe the girl. Every discarded candy wrapper, every dropped crumb, every instance of breathlessness after climbing the porch steps was noted, judged, and mentally catalogued as further proof of her initial assessment. The girl, she concluded, was a testament to indulgence and a lack of self-control. Their paths intertwined more frequently. School buses stopped at the same corner, forcing brief, uncomfortable exchanges. Mrs. Henderson would offer a curt nod, her face a mask of disapproval, her eyes lingering a beat too long on the girl's lunch bag. It was always filled with chips and prepackaged treats, a source of constant disappointment for Mrs. Henderson. The girl, sensing her disapproval, started dreading their encounters. The bus stop, once a place of excited chatter, became a minefield of tension. Mrs. Henderson's presence, always looming, felt like a silent threat. The girl felt her stomach clench every time Mrs. Henderson was near, her own reflection in the bus window seeming to mock her. The girl tried to avoid Mrs. Henderson crossing the street when she saw her gardening, hiding behind the newspaper on the bus. But it was no use. Mrs. Henderson's presence, like a shadow, seemed to follow her. The girl began to feel trapped, her every move scrutinized, judged, and found wanting. One afternoon, Mrs. Henderson went a step further. She stopped the girl on her way home, her face a mask of concern. "You know," she began, her voice a syrupy drawl, "all that sugar isn't good for you. It's going to make things difficult." The girl, confused and scared, mumbled a quick "okay" and hurried away. The girl didn't tell anyone about Mrs. Henderson's words. She couldn't explain the chilling feeling that had gripped her, the underlying threat veiled in concern. It was subtle, unspoken, but it left her shaken. The encounter, though brief, amplified the fear that had been steadily building within her. The girl's world, once filled with the simple joys of childhood, became a landscape of fear. Mrs. Henderson's words, laced with hidden meanings, echoed in her mind. The girl felt a constant pressure, a sense of impending doom she couldn't shake off. It was as if Mrs. Henderson, with her judging eyes and disapproving whispers, had cast a dark cloud over her life. Then one day the girl vanished. It was as sudden as it was inexplicable. One moment she was there, swinging listlessly on the swing set, her laughter carrying in the breeze. The next, she was gone, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to amplify her absence. The swing set stood motionless, its chains swaying slightly in the afternoon breeze, a haunting reminder of the missing girl. The yellow ribbon tied to the top, a symbol of hope, seemed to mock the growing fear in the community. Where could she have gone? The girl's disappearance sent ripples of shock through the community. Neighbors gathered, their faces etched with concern, their voices hushed with worry. The girl, despite her size and the whispers she attracted, was a part of their world. Her absence left a void, a question mark hanging heavy in the air. The police were called, their questions sharp and probing. Had anyone seen anything? Had the girl mentioned anything unusual? Suspicion fell on strangers, on the shadowy figures lurking at the edge of their memories. But the truth, as elusive as the missing girl herself, remained hidden. The community, once a place of familiar routines and shared smiles, became a breeding ground for suspicion. Every neighbor, every passerby became a potential suspect. The girl's disappearance had ripped apart the fabric of their world, leaving behind raw edges of fear and uncertainty. Days turned into weeks, hope fading with each setting sun. The girl's face, frozen in time on missing person posters, stared back at them from telephone poles and shop windows, a constant reminder of the mystery that haunted them all. Amidst the growing anxiety, Mrs. Henderson emerged as a vocal presence. She voiced her suspicions loudly, her finger pointed at anyone who didn't fit her narrative. Her words, once laced with subtle threats, now dripped with accusations. The girl, she declared, was too trusting, too easily led astray. Mrs. Henderson, fueled by her own righteousness, became the spokesperson for the community's fear. She organized search parties, her sharp voice barking orders, her eyes scanning the faces around her for any hint of guilt. The irony of her newfound concern was lost on no one. Yet, her fervor, her unwavering belief in her own narrative, held a strange power. Whispers, once hesitant, grew louder, fueled by Mrs. Henderson's pronouncements. Hadn't she warned the girl about the dangers lurking around every corner? Hadn't she predicted something like this would happen? The community, desperate for answers, clung to her words, their fear morphing into suspicion. Then, one rainy afternoon, a police car pulled up outside Mrs. Henderson's house. The sight was so unexpected, so out of place in their quiet neighborhood, that it drew the curtains of every house open. Two officers, their faces grim, walked up to Mrs. Henderson's door and knocked. The community watched, holding their breath as Mrs. Henderson opened the door, her face a mask of surprise. The officers spoke, their words too low to be heard, but their expressions spoke volumes. Mrs. Henderson's face drained of color, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of disbelief. As the officers spoke, a hush fell over the neighborhood. The rain seemed to fall harder, the rhythmic drumming on the pavement mirroring the growing anxiety. What had the police discovered? What did they know? The questions hung heavy in the air, as thick and suffocating as the humid air. The news spread like wildfire. The police, acting on a tip, had obtained a warrant to search Mrs. Henderson's house. What they found sent shockwaves through the community. Hidden beneath the perfectly manicured lawn, in a secret basement no one knew existed, was the missing girl. She was pale, thin and disoriented, but alive. The sight of her, frail but breathing, unleashed a torrent of emotions. Relief, anger, confusion, and a chilling realization that the monster they had feared lurked not in the shadows, but in plain sight, disguised as a concerned neighbor. Mrs. Henderson's carefully constructed facade crumbled. The truth, as ugly and shocking as it was, stood exposed. The woman who had positioned herself as the protector, the voice of reason, had been the architect of their collective nightmare. Her actions, driven by a need for control, a warped sense of order, had brought them to this moment. The girl's return didn't erase the scars. The community, forever marked by the experience, continued to grapple with the unsettling truth. Mrs. Henderson's motives remained a chilling enigma, her actions a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of normalcy. The girl, forever changed by her ordeal, slowly began to rebuild her life. The swing set, once a symbol of her disappearance, became a testament to her resilience. As she swung higher and higher, her laughter carried on the wind, a defiant act of reclaiming her joy. The mystery of the overweight girl's disappearance might have been solved, but the shadows lingered. They lingered in the cautious glances exchanged between neighbors, in the hushed whispers that followed.